Good morning to everybody who's just joined, and welcome to this morning's session on developing research questions and selecting outcome measures as part of your evaluation of attainment raising initiative. So this is the second session in a three-part series that we're running. Hopefully many of you were able to join us 2 weeks ago for a session on theories of change, and we also have our third and final session coming up in 2 weeks' time, which will be looking at impact evaluation methodologies. I am going to go ahead and get us started because we have quite a lot of content to get through today. But just to say, as usual for these sessions, we're using the webinar format in Zoom, so you will all be muted and your cameras off. You won't be able to see or hear each other, but hopefully we're loud and clear and you can see and hear us. And we have a Q&A function on this format on Zoom. So you should see a little box at the bottom of your screen, and you will be able to write and submit written questions into that box throughout the session today. And we'll make sure we leave a little bit of time at the end to answer as many of those questions as we can. But without further ado, I'm gonna kick us off and get started. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Nicolette, who is on screen here. Nicolette's going to talk you through the bulk of our content today, and then I'll come back and support with the question and answer session at the end. So over to you, Nicolette.
Thank you so much, Rain. So just a brief overview of what we will be covering today. So I will go over firstly what was covered in your last attainment raising series where you developed a theory of change. And then I will give a brief introduction into what today's session will be about. And then we will talk about developing primary and secondary research questions. And then we will go over the outcome measures and indicators for that, and as well doing some signposting to resources that TASO have, and then discussing what is next up in the series. So in your previous webinar, you were talking about developing a theory of change. So here you can see TASO's monitoring and evaluation framework, which is a 4-step process explaining the necessary steps to consider when planning your evaluation. So as previously mentioned, you previously looked at the diagnose stage of this monitoring evaluation framework, where again, like I said, you developed a theory of change. So initially, the theory of change looks something like this, and my colleague Rain took you through each sequential step from number 1 all the way to 8. So I'll just briefly go over what was discussed. So initially, you talked about what your situation was. So this was, there was a particular issue in relation to weak reading/literacy skills among underrepresented and disadvantaged students. And this was then a barrier to them progressing to HE. We then talked about what our aims were. So we looked at to raise attainment levels across Key Stage 3 students in selected schools, but also bolstering their confidence in their academic abilities, and then ensuring that students achieve higher standard in core subjects. And then our second aim was then to kind of introduce students to higher education, providing them with like a valuable insight into the various educational pathways and career possibilities that higher education can offer. From that point, we then thought about what our impact was going to be. So we started and thinking about, well, what would we hope our intervention to achieve? And that was essentially to improve the attainment in English at Key Stage 3, but also increasing the likelihood of progressing to HE. We then did this back mapping process of where then we thought about where we opened up our attainment raising mapping activities tool, and we opened the practical spreadsheet and we selected relevant outcomes, a mixture of both short-term, intermediate, and long-term, being both behavioral and non-behavioral, from our outcome bins. And for example, we selected increased student engagement, improved reading literacy skills, and so forth. We then at that point then decided to have a look at what activities were most related to these particular outcomes. So for example, the outcome of improved reading skills was linked to literacy sessions, and the outcomes increased student knowledge and increased academic self-efficacy were both linked to subject-specific tutoring. So from here, we then kind of were able to develop these skills into, for example, small group tutoring sessions, and for example, further developing that into like 12 sessions delivered weekly. From here, then we devised our outputs, which were looking at students being exposed to 12 hours of tutoring sessions, but also students having the ability to read up to 5 books. And then from our outputs, we thought about our inputs. So what were the tangible and intangible things that were needed to get our activities accomplished and then hopefully achieve our intended impact. And this was, for example, looking at things like the venue hire, funding, of age-appropriate material. And then number 8, we looked at our rationale. So what were the underpinning assumptions that would have explained the causal mechanism that allows us to achieve our input, activities, outputs, outcomes, and then our impact? So this was the theory of change that you kind of ended up with after our last attainment series. So like Rain said, today we're going to be focusing on developing research questions and selecting outcome measures based off the theory of change that we developed last time. And again, just to reintroduce and say again that in terms of our monitoring evaluation framework, for today, we're going to be looking at this plan phase and we're going to be looking at the measure phase. And within the measure phase, I will be taking you through the first part, this collect data part, giving you a brief overview of the sources for data collection that can be used to inform the impact of our evaluation. So first of all, it's really crucial to understand why research questions are important. And research questions are important because they play a fundamental role in shaping the evaluation and the research process. So research questions serve as a roadmap for the entire evaluation process. They really help define the scope, objectives, and the focus of the evaluation. Without clear research questions, the evaluation may lack direction, making it challenging to collect relevant data and draw really meaningful conclusions. Research questions are also important because they help in clearly defining what aspects of the intervention will be investigated. But they're also important because they provide a structured framework for designing and conducting evaluation activities. They guide the development of data collection, the selection of outcome measures, as well as indicators, and the as well the identification of key variables that need to be assessed. And finally, research questions are fundamental, but also are the foundation to a successful evaluation. By posing specific research questions, researchers can then focus on collecting data that directly addresses the research objectives and aims. This ensures that the information that is gathered is relevant and contributes to answering the overarching research question, that being the primary research question. So there are 4 steps when coming to thinking about developing research questions. First one being that you want to familiarize yourself with your theory of change. And hopefully you are quite familiar with the theory of change that we would have developed in our previous series. And again, I will revise over it very briefly. And then step 2 is define the evaluation purpose and scope. Step 3 is then determine the type of evaluation design we hope to conduct. So is this going to be implementation and process evaluation, or is it going to be one that's impact? Is it going to be an impact evaluation? And then step 4 is to then draft your research question. So let's take a look at step 1. So step 1 is to review your literacy theory of change. So I've just gone over it, but again, just to kind of remind everyone that these were the inputs, the activities, the outputs, but then also the outcomes and the impact that we hope for our intervention. And so in becoming familiar with the theory of change, we can start to think about what parts of it are testable. So this is why you need to become quite familiar with the theory of change, because it allows you kind of take a step back and understand, well, what parts of my outcomes can be testable? What part of my outputs are testable? So this is why it's really important to become familiar with your theory of change. Step 2 is to then define the evaluation purpose and scope. So it's really important that you determine what the scope and the purpose of your evaluation is, because this will help to guide the development of a focused but also relevant primary research question, which also ensures relevance and significance to the theory of change that we would have created. So in understanding what scope means, scope refers to what you're going to include or look at and what you're going to leave out, whereas purpose refers to what your intervention hopes to achieve or address through its investigation. And it's absolutely critical to link your primary research question with the purpose and the scope of the evaluation. So here we've kind of narrowed down our scope, which comes from the situation, which is, again, the number one step that we do in our theory of change, where we describe what the current problem is. So here, the scope is that we're going to focus on improving students' reading and literacy skills, but also targeting students facing barriers to educational progression and at a risk of lower GCSE skills. So here we've already said what we're going to include. We're going to be including students from a particular group. We're going to be looking at improving students' reading and literacy skills. And then for our purpose, again, just to remind you, purpose is about what the evaluation hopes to achieve. So for our purpose, we want to improve attainment by providing support in reading and literacy. We want to improve students' readiness and likelihood of progress into HE. So just hold the scope and the purpose in your mind for now, because it's going to come into play later on in step 4. So step 3 is you need to determine the type of evaluation that you're going to conduct. This is important because the type of evaluation that you decide to conduct will solely determine the type of questions that you could answer. So with research questions that are focused on implementation and process evaluation, it's about asking the what, the who, the where, the why, and the how. But that's in relation to the inputs, the activities, the outputs. So who was targeted in our activities? Were the right target groups targeted? So that's where these kind of process-led evaluations will test. Whereas research questions that are outcome focused and more impact evaluation led will kind of look at changes and effects that occur in your outcomes. So then your short-term, your intermediate, your long-term outcomes, and it will look for changes and effects and impacts in your attitudes, behaviors, and skills. So just to let you know that in relation to today's today's intervention and developing research questions, it will be focused on looking at the impact side of things. So looking at the outcomes, the impact of what our intervention will be. So we'll be testing this particular part of the theory of change. So in pulling it all together, and then just putting forward like what is the primary research question, so everyone knows the primary research question is what is the main focus or the goal of the investigation, and this is what our primary research question will be. So to figure that out, we now need to use the scope and the purpose that we've defined in step 2, and then kind of slot them into this template that we have below. So there's 2 options that you can use to kind of devise a primary research question. It all gives the same level of information. It's just that the words changed, but it's all, if you choose between 2 templates, it's fine. You can also come up with your own, but this is just to help you have a good starting base. So a template that you can use for the research question could be, did X program/intervention increase X main outcome among X group? So let's just do some like word smithing where we can like take some of the keywords from the scope. So from our scope, this kind of gives us who the focus group is, so who the group of interest is, was that being students that are facing different barriers, whereas the purpose allows us to kind of draw out what our main outcome is. So if we kind of put this all together, we will come up with a primary question and 2 of them, because in our impact column, this is where our primary question is relating to, like, what is the primary focus? What is the goal of our intervention? And that is why I've just got here in that blue box, reminding you what our impact are. So our primary research question, 2 of them that we've come up with, because we've got 2 different impacts that we're interested in. So did a 12-week literacy program increase attainment in English at Key Stage 3 for underrepresented and disadvantaged students from chosen schools? And the other primary research question that we have is, in a Key Stage 3 students from chosen schools, what is the impact of implementing a 12-week literacy program on increasing the likelihood of progressing to HE? So you can see here, we've got our main group, our main outcome, or looking at. We've got the particular target group, and then we've used words such as increase and impact because it's going to be an impact-led evaluation. So once you've established your primary research question, we can start to think about the secondary research questions that our evaluation will seek to answer. And secondary research questions are sub-questions derived from our original overarching primary research question. And that's kind of what these arrows are showing. So essentially, your secondary research question should be answering something that will then lead to adding to answering your overarching primary research question. And I hope that kind of makes sense. So your secondary research question should focus on addressing a specific impact or aspect of the intervention for certain groups, or on short, intermediate, or maybe more longer term outcomes. And these are where your secondary questions should be focused. So in thinking about the outcomes that we would have selected based on our theory of change, I have just chosen two of them, one of them being from a short-term behavioral and the other one being from an intermediate non-behavioral outcome. And we can think about how we can make these two options into secondary research questions based on this particular template. So using this template, we can say, did X intervention increase or decrease main X outcome among X group? So here we can fill it in for one for academic self-efficacy. So did a 12-week literacy program improve academic self-efficacy among Key Stage 3 students in selected schools? Or we could say, to what extent did a 12-week literacy program increase student engagement with academic studies among Key Stage 3 students in selected schools? Both of these secondary questions provide the same information. They're just looking at two different aspects of our selected outcomes, one being from a short term and the other one being from an intermediate outcome. And again, it's just to say that in having these two secondary questions, we know and we can assume that they will, in answering them, they will then provide answers to our overarching primary research question. So, outcome measures and indicators. So I hope you guys are all still with me. But now we're going to be looking at outcome measures and indicators. So we've just now created what our primary and secondary research questions are. And now we need to kind of start to consider which outcome measures are best able to answer them and the indicators that will be able to demonstrate success. But I just want to firstly put forward, but also demonstrate that there is a difference between outcome measures and indicators. Sometimes they are kind of used interchangeably, but they serve different processes. So they serve different purposes, but they are related. So what is an outcome measure? An outcome measure can be thought as a very specific variable or parameter or a tool that can be used to assess the success and the effectiveness of an intervention. And essentially, in like really simplified terms, an outcome measure gauges the results of an intervention. So there are generally 5 types of broad categories that outcome measures fall into, and I'm just going to give you a brief introduction into these 5. So number 1 being core impact outcome measures. These are measures that directly assess the intended impact or goal of the intervention, where you have interim or proxy outcome measures that give insight into the progress of an intervention. We then have validated scales outcome measures that offer more like a standardized and reliable method of accurately measuring outcome constructs, which is really good for reliability and validity. And then we have these last 2, self-reported objective and self-report subjective, which are very different. So self-report objective is more concerned with measuring factual information about an individual's achievement or knowledge without that subjective interpretation, where self-report subjective outcome measures assess a participant's view or feelings about their experiences or their perceived knowledge of something, thus introducing that subjective nature of it. But I also want to say that there are outcome measures that already exist, such as you have validated scales that are already out there in the HE context and beyond. So for example, TASO, we have an axis that's been validated, it's been tested, so we know the outcomes or the things that it's measuring is measuring what it intends to. But you also have outcome measures that can be created. And it's just to say that when we are thinking about an outcome measure, it's good to kind of angle them when we are wanting to use them, looking at validated scales and above. You can, of course, do outcome measures that are self-report subjective or objective, but best practice is for going for things that are above the validated scales, interim or proxy outcome measures, and as well as core impact measures as well. So next, we're going to look at the indicators. So what are indicators? Indicators are what we use to demonstrate a measurable change in our outcome. Indicators can then be categorized into two categories: observable and unobservable. Observable indicators are ones that can be directly seen, they're measured, and they can be observed. They're typically things that are tangible, they're quantifiable factors that are measurable through means such as surveys, assessments, or direct observation, whereas unobservable indicators are things that are not directly observable or visible, things such as motivation, unmeasured attitudes, anything that influences outcomes that are not known or cannot be controlled. And that's what an unobservable indicator is. So a good way to think about an indicator, and I hope this makes it a bit easy, is that I know, you can think of it as, I know I've reached a particular outcome when I see indicator X. So thinking about maybe one of the outcomes we selected before, like I know I've improved student engagement. I know student engagement has improved when I observe like a 20% increase in class participation. So like the indicator here is a 20% increase in class participation rates that's been observed. I've seen it. It's something that's happened. And then finally, we need to think about the data source. So what is a data source? A data source is the origin or the location for which data is collected. And there are two types of broad categories for data sources. You have primary data sources, which refers to the collection of new or original data for a specific purpose or study, while you have secondary data sources that involve using existing sources, existing data that was collected by others for different means different means beyond why we may be accessing that particular data. And it's just to say as well that I know people that were present in our last series, you would have been shown our attainment, our moat. And part of the moat right at the bottom is that you've got this little section called data sources. And you can kind of see we've kind of shown this as a place where if you are looking for these sources to support your indicators or your outcome measures, these are the places that provide higher education relevant data sources. So adding it all together, our outcome measures are specific variables or parameters or a tool that can be used to assess the success of our literacy intervention. The indicator is the measurable marker we use to measure progress towards our intended goal. Our data source is the original location for where data is collected. And all these elements come together in allowing us to truly understand the impact of our literacy intervention, but also contributes to the overall rigor and credibility of our impact evaluation findings. And again, I'll reiterate it, that it's the selection of appropriate outcome measures and indicators, along with the use of a reliable data source, that is critical in assessing the true impact of our intervention. So As discussed previously, our primary research question represents the primary focus or goal of our investigation. And for us, this relates to, like I said, our outcome column. So I will briefly kind of take you through each outcome step by step, as well as the impact ones, and kind of go through the outcome measures, the type of outcomes, the indicators, and explain it through. So just bear with me, but we'll get it done. So in our literacy intervention, one of our goals was to, one, improve attainment in English at Key Stage 3, but also increase the likelihood of progress into HE. So for interest that we're going to look to select an outcome measure for, or a measure for, would be improved attainment in English at Key Stage 3. So here the outcome measure that we can use to measure this particular outcome would be, for example, an English test, an in-school English test, such as like a national curriculum test that's taken at the end of Key Stage 3. This type of outcome measure is a core impact measure, as it directly assesses the intended impact of our literacy intervention. The indicator that we can use could be the percentage number of students attaining improved grades in English. And this would then, thinking about the type of data that will be collected from this indicator, would be a quantitative type of data. And the source for this would be local school data. And the point of collection box I've left blank, as maybe it could be a point for you to think about, well, when could we collect this information? But also my colleague that will be delivering the next attainment webinar series will then go over points of collection. So for today, that's going to be left blank, but it could be a penny of thought for you to think about for yourselves at home where you are now. And then for our impact of increased likelihood to progress to HE, the outcome measure that we could use to assess this would be the Access and Success Questionnaire, looking at the HE expectation scale, where this type of outcome measure is a validated scale, which is good because the underlying constructs we know definitely have been tested, so we can be confident that they are measuring, for example, HE expectations of students that would take this particular survey. And then the indicator that we could use would be looking at maybe the increased number of students that report thinking about HE. And again, the type of data that will be collected from this is quantitative, as the Access and Success Questionnaire is a closed form of test questionnaire. And then the data source from this, I hope it's pretty obvious, would be the questionnaire itself. This is where the information is coming from. So these outcome, or these particular impacts that was in our last column, or impact column, these are then the measures that can be used for us then to determine if we've actually gone about in doing that impact as intended. So just to kind of take you through the Access and Success Questionnaire, this is what it would look like, for example, for the higher education's expectations. When you open then the drop-down menu, it would look something like this, giving you what the definition is, then the relevance, so you understand, making sure that it's actually pre-entry, it's not something that's taken, being used as a scale for testing like in university, for example. And then the particular item that we would use to kind of measure HE expectations, or moving towards likelihood of progress into HE, would be this particular item where it says, I'm thinking about going to higher education in the future. And the rating would be from strongly agree to strongly disagree to agree. And then again, here were the outcomes that we kind of selected in our outcomes column, a mixture, again, just looking at the short term, intermediate term, and long term. So I'm going to take you through a similar example to this one for each of these outcome measures, but it's just to say that obviously the secondary research question that we devised before was looking at increased student engagement with academic studies and increased academic self-efficacy. And the examples I will provide here are, again, what you can use to measure that particular secondary question. So I hope that makes sense. So looking at the short term, when thinking about measures and indicators and data sources related to shorter term outcomes, we can kind of follow the similar format that we did previously. So for the outcome measure of increased student engagement with academic studies, we could use the outcome measure here. Could be an in-school register, which is again the tool that will allow us to see attendance in classes. This type of outcome measure is a proxy measure. The indicator here could be Key Stage 3 students express an interest in their knowledge of English of so this particular outcome could be, it's a proxy measure. The indicator that we could do could be the percentage change in the number of Key Stage 3 students regularly attending classes. The data to be selected would be quantitative, and the data source here would be a secondary data source. So it's a local school registry. It's not the data source that we're accessing wasn't necessarily collected of assessing student engagement. It was collected for a different. This is good. So for our second short-term outcome, this one looking at non-behavioral, we can look at increased student knowledge. So the outcome measure that we could do here is like a semi-structured interview. This one would be a self-report subjective measure. And the indicator we could do here is looking at Key Stage 3 students that express an increase in their knowledge within this, for example, interview, during that interview. And the data to be collected here is qualitative, but also the data source, again, hopefully it's obvious, would be the interview itself. And then when we look at outcome measures for intermediate one, when we look at the intermediate one for improved reading skills, which is a behavioral type of outcome, the outcome measure here that we could use to assess the success of our literacy intervention in reaching this outcome could be reading comprehension tests. This type of outcome measure is more of a self-report subjective measure. And the indicator we could use here could be the percentage of students attaining like a 10-point grade average increase in reading comprehension skills. And again, the data to be collected here would be quantitative, and the data source for this information would be local school data. And again, being a second source of information, a secondary data source. And then for our next outcome being increased academic self-efficacy, the outcome measure here we could use is the access and success questionnaire, which is again another validated scale, so we can be confident in terms of the fact that it is actually assessing the academic self-efficacy of the student that's taken the test. And the data here to be collected would be quantitative. And again, data source, hopefully it's obvious, would be the survey. And again, here is another one of TASO's resources that we've created. So here is the Common Outcome Measures Framework, which we've devised to help the sector identify common outcome measures and indicators that cover across the student life cycle. Obviously, for today's presentation, it'll be focused on Key Stage 3. So this is just kind of highlighting that you can, for example, look to one of our resources to kind of see what common outcome measures are available and possible for any intervention that you're doing. And again, just to kind of show that within the Access and Success Questionnaire, we have, again, these 13 different constructs. The first one being assessing academic self-efficacy. Once we open it up, again, it looks something very similar like this. And then, again, we can then have a look and see what the actual items for the questionnaire is. So looking at, am I confident that I can get the exam results required to progress to higher education and so forth. And again, the rating is the same in terms of going from strongly agree to disagree to strongly agree. And then we can look at outcome measures indicators for our longer term outcomes. So looking at our outcome for increased Key Stage 3 attainment, the outcome measure that we could do here is the National Curriculum Assessments. This is a type of a core impact measure because it's directly assessing the intended goal of our intervention. The indicator here we could use is like the percentage of Key Stage 3 students attaining improved grades. And then the data to be collected again would be quantitative, and the source for this information could be the National Pupil Database. And just for this last one, I thought it would be good to give people two options so they can see that you can get both qualitative and quantitative data from a particular outcome. So for this particular outcome being increased sense of belonging, we could use one of them being a focus group discussion, with that being a type of self-report subjective outcome measure. And again, the indicator here we could use is the Key Stage 3 students expressing an increased sense of belonging at HE institutions. That type of data to be collected will be qualitative. And again, it's a self-report, it being that the data source is the interview itself. And then when thinking about another one, we could use sense of belonging in the ASQ scale, that being a validated scale again, and we can now look at the number of students reporting a higher sense of belonging at HE, and then again, that being quantitative, and it would be in a self-report study. So here again, you can see the ASQ scale, and it being that sense of belonging access pre-entry, because again, we're focusing on the Key Stage 3, which is prior to accessing higher education. We open it up, and again, looks very similar format. And then from that point on now, we can now look at the items on the scale, and then think about is higher education for people like me, and so forth. So just a quick recap. So initially we had a look at we first devised what the scope and the purpose was of our particular research questions that we would hope to develop based on our theory of change. We then at that point developed what our primary research question was. We then thought about what our secondary research questions were, as these were sub-questions to the overarching primary research question. From this point, we then thought about the outcome measures. So that being the outcome measures being like what would help us know that we're tracking as we should. And then the indicators we spoke about. We then spoke about the data sources. And then finally, the research protocol in putting this all together. And really it's just to kind of say that TASO, we've got a research protocol template where, for example, in the background section, we can talk about the types of sources and types of financial material and other support, and these would come from our theory of change. So it's just to kind of say that the theory of change really has input at every single stage within the research protocol. So it's really of a benefit to do a theory of change and really follow that monitoring and evaluation framework. And again, this is just to kind of say that we've got available resources. And just for today, we've looked at the mapping and outcomes activities tool for both the pre-entry and the attainment raising. We also have a common outcomes measurements framework. We have the access and success questionnaire that we've used today, and also TASO's research protocol. And then just to say that you can join our next webinar in the series on the 12th of December, where my colleague Sarah will be discussing choosing an evaluation methodology. And we'll be discussing different evaluation methodologies and how to choose the appropriate methodology for that.